Welcome back to the second half of this talk. How can I be happier? In the first half, we began to look at the question of happiness and how elusive it often is to find, let alone to hold on to, despite all our best attempts to do so. And we began to ask the question, what's lacking? What is it that we're still missing in our pursuit of happiness? And could the issue possibly be that we have too much to live with, but not enough to live for? Well, these are very good questions, and actually, the latest research from the fields of neuroscience as well as social science has something very helpful to say to our questions. Because according to Arthur C. Brooks, a professor of psychology at Harvard, all the best research from these fields now says that in addition to meeting all the needs on Maslow's pyramid that we talked about in the first half of this talk, including the higher needs for self-esteem and self-actualization, something more is still needed in order for human beings to experience happiness. And that something more, according to neuroscience and social science, is a coherent and overarching sense of the meaning or purpose of life itself. A Jewish psychologist by the name of Viktor Frankl discovered this truth in a concentration camp during World War II. While contemplating how to survive the immense challenges of his imprisonment, Frankl began observing his fellow prisoners in the hope of discovering what coping mechanism worked well. And he discovered that it was those individuals who could not find a meaning greater than their present sufferings who despaired, lost hope, and eventually gave up and died. Conversely, those individuals that could find a purpose in life or a hope for the future beyond their present ordeal were far more likely to survive. And in his classic work, Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl explains that the quest for contentment and satisfaction in life will always fall short if it is limited merely to the project of the self or of self-actualization. He writes, what is called self-actualization is not an attainable aim at all, for the simple reason that the more one would strive for it, the more he would miss it. In other words, self-actualization is possible only as a side effect of self-transcendence. Now, a great example of this comes from the myriad of stories from Londoners who lived through the Blitz and the constant aerial bombardment of German planes, and who described that time as one of the happiest of their lives. Why? Well, because their lives were infused with a cause or a sense of purpose greater than themselves. Winston Churchill's private secretary, John Martin, wrote that people came to see themselves as protagonists on a vaster scene and champions of a high and invincible cause for which the stars in their courses were fighting. The reason we struggle to find happiness, believed the great Russian writer Leo Tolstoy, is because each person is a natural egoist who sees the world as if it were a novel in which he or she were the hero, whereas the truly good life begins when a person can see the world as if he or she were a minor character in someone else's novel. In other words, Tolstoy would say, you need to realize that it's not all about you. There's a bigger story. Now, of course, that sort of thinking flies in the face of much of our popular culture's happiness experts who continue to follow Maslow's theory that once the lower needs are met, happiness is all about meeting our needs for self-fulfillment and self-actualization. But fascinatingly, even though most introductory psychology textbooks don't mention it, towards the end of his life, Maslow eventually recognized this truth as well, that in order to be happy, we must discover a meaning or purpose to life that is bigger than ourselves. And Maslow called this need the need for self-transcendence, and he placed it at the very top of his pyramid. This inbuilt human need for a meaning or purpose greater than ourselves explains why scientists have found that those with a spiritual practice or who follow religious beliefs tend to be happier than those who don't. For example, in Time magazine's special 2016 edition entitled The Science of Happiness, we read that study after study has found that religious people tend to be less depressed and less anxious than others and better able to handle the ups and downs of life. Of course, many people take the view that a sense of meaning and purpose in life can be found without recourse to religion or to God. The British writer Stephen Fry, for example, in an online video entitled How to Be Happy, argues that meaning is not to be found in any sort of divine plan or cosmic purpose to the universe, but rather in the meaning that we create for ourselves, which he says can be in anything that we choose, including, for example, a commitment to politics or our career or some artistic endeavour. Or he says just in simple pleasures such as drinking wine with friends or hiking together in nature. However, according to a 2015 study by researchers at the London School of Economics, the only social activity associated with sustained happiness was participating in a religious organisation, even more than volunteering for a charity, taking educational courses, or participating in a political or community organisation. And it raises the question, why is that? Well, I want to suggest that it might have something to do with the difference between two different types of meaning, which social psychologists refer to, the first being situational meaning and the second global meaning. Situational meaning refers to the meaning we create or assign to particular things or events in life, such as, for example, our possessions or our job or our friendships or our artistic hobbies, whereas global meaning, on the other hand, is a big picture, comprehensive framework of what the whole of life is all about. And it's only a global meaning to life that is able to meet the human need for self-transcendence, enabling us to experience happiness not just in our lives, but with our lives as we live them in and for this bigger story. And according to social psychologist Roy Baumeister, a global meaning is one that can convincingly answer four fundamental questions. The question of identity, who am I? The question of value, do I matter? The question of purpose, why am I here? And the question of agency, can I make a difference? We see this analysis ring true, I think, in the fascinating story of Leo Tolstoy, that great Russian novelist, and his decades-long search for meaning and happiness after he rejected Christianity as a child. And first of all, he thought, well, maybe pleasure's the answer, just having a great time. So he partied with the rich and famous, sleeping around, gambling, drinking, living a wild life, but he found it just didn't satisfy. And then he thought, well, maybe money's the answer. And he'd inherited a lot of money and he made money out of his books, but he found that didn't satisfy either, no matter how much he had. And then he thought, well, maybe the answer is success, fame. He wrote some of the greatest novels in world literature, but still he said it didn't satisfy. He thought, well, maybe the answer is family life, to give my family the best possible life. He married and had 13 children, but still he wasn't satisfied. So there he was, having achieved all his ambitions, surrounded by what is considered to be complete happiness, and yet one question drove him to the verge of despair. And the question was this: what meaning has my life that the inevitability of death does not destroy? And the answer the brightest minds of his day could give him in response to the question was, in the infinity of space and the infinity of time, infinitely small particles mutate with infinite complexity. Needless to say, Tolstoy did not find that answer very satisfying, and I imagine neither do you. So Tolstoy kept looking and looking until finally he found in the peasant people of Russia the answer he'd been looking for: their faith in God through Jesus Christ. A faith that enabled them to answer the big questions of life satisfactorily, and a faith that enabled them to find the one thing that he and his contemporaries had been unable to find: genuine happiness, even in the midst of poverty and pain. A genuine happiness that Tolstoy just couldn't argue against. Tolstoy saw for himself that Christian faith is a faith that works in the real world. A faith that's time-tested, if you were, by reality and experience, and a faith that explains why our repeated attempts to find lasting happiness in pleasure or money or fame or success ultimately fail. And a faith that satisfactorily answers the four big questions that we noted earlier must be answered in order for life to be comprehensively meaningful. Who am I? Do I matter? Why am I here? And can I make a difference? And according to Christianity, your identity, who you are, comes not from what you do, but from who you are based on whose you are, God's beloved creation. And it says that you really do matter because you are more than just matter. You are a spiritual being purposely made for an eternal future in God's good universe. And it says that your life does have a purpose, which is to love and to be loved in loving relationship with the one from whom love itself ultimately derives. And it says that your life does make a difference because you were made to make a difference. And because the choices you make in this life echo not only in this life, but for all eternity. A few years ago, I spent a week speaking to some very successful and financially well-off people in a number of investment banks and consultancy firms in London on some of the big questions of life. And what I found absolutely fascinating was that people kept sharing the same thing during question time and conversations, which was this feeling or sentiment that they all felt that at the end of the day, there has to be something more to life than simply that which this material world has to offer. I wonder if you've ever experienced a feeling like that. C.S. Lewis, the renowned Oxford professor, called this feeling or desire the secret signature of every human soul. This sense, this longing, this hope for something almost indescribable, but something beyond that which this material world seems capable of offering. He also argued in his book, Mere Christianity, that this desire is a clue or a pointer towards the existence of something beyond the material world. He writes, "Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger, well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire, well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world." According to Christianity, we were never meant to live a life in which we are the main character in the story. We were always meant to live in a much bigger story, a much bigger world, in God's story and in what He's doing in His world through His Son, Jesus. And the fact that we've got this wrong explains why even when we do follow all the advice in books and magazines on how to find happiness, and we eat healthy food and exercise and stretch and avoid bad relationships and breathe deeply and all that, we still feel as though something is missing. We still experience an inner restlessness and lack of peace. And it's because those popular prescriptions for a happier life, as helpful as they are at best only plasters trying to cover over the symptoms, when the real root of the problem is spiritual. In Plato's Symposium, Aristophanes tells the story of how Zeus, fearing that the powerful and physically perfect humans would rise against him, split human beings in half so that each person is really only a half of a greater whole, and that we will never be happy in life unless we find our other half in this world, our soulmate, the only one who can complete us. And obviously this idea of finding our one true soulmate has formed the basis of many a romance novel or Hollywood film. Now, Christianity would say that in one respect, Aristophanes was right. Our hearts have been ripped asunder. But it would also say that in another respect, he was wrong, because nothing in this world, not even another human being, will ever fully heal that wound or satisfy that need. In his book, Confessions, the first autobiography in recorded history, we read about a young North African man named Augustine and his heart's search for happiness in sex and relationships, as well as in celebrity and success. And because Augustine is so brilliant, and because the Roman Empire of which he is a part is so full of opportunity, he is able to find and to achieve all that he longs for, except for satisfaction, except for happiness. And so in desperation, eventually he turns to philosophy, and all that thinking and reading eventually leads him to Christianity. And in encountering Christianity, he finally realizes something. He says, "My mistake consisted of this, that I sought pleasure and sublimity not in God, but in His creatures, in myself and other created beings." And then in what is perhaps the most famous line from his book, he concludes, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. It's for this very reason that the philosopher Blaise Pascal once observed, there are only three kinds of people. Those who seek God and have found Him, these are wise and happy. Those who seek God and have not yet found Him, these are wise and unhappy. And those who live without either seeking God or finding Him, and these are both unwise and unhappy. Because according to Christian faith, there is a deep paradox at the heart of the universe, which is that if you only seek for happiness, you will never find it. But if you seek for God, you'll get happiness thrown in as well, because it's God for whom our hearts were made to love and to worship. Life with God. That's what we were ultimately made for. And thankfully, we don't have to seek far to find God, because the Bible says that God has already sought us and has revealed himself to us most clearly and most intimately through his dear Son, Jesus. As Jesus himself says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. And interestingly, though Jesus himself was the most joyous person who's ever lived, the Bible also describes him as a man of sorrows, helping us to see that the sort of happiness that we find in God, it's not a shallow or a surface happiness that is dependent on life always going smoothly. It's a deep well of joy that never runs dry, even in times of desolation or drought, because there's a place for both deep joy and for profound sadness in the expanse of God's love for the world. And it's in the expanse of God's love that lasting happiness is ultimately found. And so although Jesus doesn't promise us a life without pain or loss or suffering or disappointment, he does promise to be with us through all of these things and to be in himself our life, our peace, our consolation, and our joy, no matter who we are. The one thing we can all agree is that we all want to be happy. And human experience tells us that we'll do just about anything to find it. And yet, according to the Bible, if we ignore this spiritual dimension to who we are as human beings, then contentment will forever remain elusive. But the Bible shows us another way, a way, in fact, that's so simple it is almost scandalous. For the Christian secret of happiness is simply Jesus. And so to say yes to Jesus, as countless of his followers around the world and throughout human history would testify, is to say yes to true satisfaction and to a deep and everlasting joy.
Hi guys, my name is Abby. I'm the Comms Director here at OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. We just want to say a big thank you for watching this film. At OCCA, we love to speak about the big questions of our times and how to show the Christian faith provides credible and valuable answers. If you enjoyed this film, check out the other stuff on our channel, and please also consider subscribing and following us. It helps us make more things like this. We also want to hear from you. If you have ideas for new content, put them in the comments or get in touch with us directly. Our thanks goes out to the speakers, the donors, our film team, and you guys for making this happen. Fun fact, it takes us over 60 hours to make each of these talks. We want to make sure the content is incredibly well researched, it looks and flows beautifully, and ultimately that it is actually useful to you, the people who view it. This means a lot of research, listening to the audience, and filmmaking. Our incredible staff at OCCA who make these films are funded by donations. So if you want to partner with us in our work, please consider donating, which is really easy. Just click the donate button on our website. See you next time.